The restaurant glows like a snow globe, all soft lights and polished glass, and she sits at the center of it in a red dress that holds its breath for her. Emily does not lift her chin. She anchors it to dignity as laughter ripples behind her like a draft under a door. A man in a blue suit stands near the table, half-turned, indifferent, the profile of someone who belongs here. Champagne catches the light, cruelly cheerful. Two men at a nearby table smirk into their glasses, shoulders shaking. Somewhere off-frame, a Christmas tree blurs into gold. She has rehearsed smiles for guests for months, but none of them fit on her face now. The linen beneath her fingertips is thick and expensive, and she presses it as if it could press back. The room holds a steady clink of cutlery, elegant and anonymous, the soundtrack of other people's certainty. Her pearl earrings, borrowed brightness, feel heavier than they should. She wills her eyes to stay clear, to stay wide, to say, "Not this time." The air tastes like cold apples and delay. On the table, a single place card with her name written in a careful hand, a white promise turned grey by the knowing around her. The joke lives in the space between every glance, darting, hiding, returning, like a sparrow trapped behind glass. Someone lifts a phone, then lowers it, then lifts it again. Emily feels the lens even when it doesn't face her. She thinks of how kindness never thinks of evidence. She realizes tonight has been meticulously arranged for proof. 2 seconds forward and she would stand, 2 seconds back and she would still believe. Instead, she lingers in the held breath, in the pause where hope is a glass filament not yet snapped. Her heart keeps an elegant rhythm, as if refusing to embarrass her with noise. The red dress warms her shoulders, a small furnace against the draft of ridicule. The blue-suited man shifts, clearing his throat, not to help, not to harm, merely to exist in the way of it. The maitre d' glides by, a swan of neutrality. No one interrupts the performance. She imagines the invitation floating again in her inbox, brief and improbable, the single line that made her laugh alone in the break room. She imagines the tiny miracle of a name, his, typed without ceremony. She imagined, foolishly, that miracles move quietly. Perhaps they do. She learned to believe in small things: warm coffee at 5 a.m., a seat on the subway, a stranger's thank you. It does not feel like a crime to hope for one beautiful, unnecessary moment. Not until the moment sharpens into a blade. Behind her the laughter softens, not out of mercy but fatigue, as jokes do when their makers tire of carrying them. Someone says her name, sweetly, falsely, and another shushes him, wanting the scene to breathe on its own. She lowers her hands to her lap and squares her shoulders. In the mirror of a silver wine bucket, she finds her face and the ghost of her mother's voice. "Stand as if goodness can see you." She nods once, so small it cannot be mocked. The nod is for her alone. The waiter approaches and stops, caught between protocol and pity, choosing protocol. "Would you like to keep the table a few more minutes?" he murmurs, giving her a bridge she might cross with grace. Emily thanks him. The word steady, a bridge she builds back. He refills a water glass that doesn't need refilling and withdraws with the practiced erasure of staff who have learned to vanish. She exhales for the first time in a minute that has become its own season. The room resumes its clock. The blue-suited man finally takes the seat across from her, not as a rescuer, simply as a participant who has lost interest in the game's rules. He says something ordinary about the weather, a line tossed into a deep pool. She nods without hearing. His cologne, winter clean, drifts and disappears. He smiles, quick and thin, and checks his phone. Emily is suddenly aware of how loud the centerpiece roses smell. She would like the world to be unscented, undecorated, unobserved. She touches the edge of her place card and slides it a centimeter, reclaiming the smallest square of earth. The card leaves a faint trail on the linen, a comet of pulp and ink. She wishes for a door she can step through that is not the service corridor, not the back stair with the broken bulb, not the cold alley where deliveries sweat. She wishes for a door that opens onto quiet. The pianist begins Silent Night, trying to be background and, therefore, everywhere. She swallows the ache the song brings. Somewhere near the bar, a champagne cork pops with festive violence, and the smirkers startle, then laugh again, happy to be reminded what to do. Emily folds her napkin, a slow, domestic motion that steadies the world. Every lesson she has ever learned about not making a fuss gathers at her spine. She rises an inch, then sits back, because leaving is also a line in a play, and she will not be directed. Her breath evens. Her gaze clears. The joke, left to itself, begins to shrink. And then the door at the far end opens, letting in a blade of colder air and a hush that does not belong to music. Heads turn in a single tide, first curious, then careful. The blue-suited man feels it and straightens. The smirkers lose their place in the script. Emily does not look yet. She looks at her hands and waits for her heartbeat to finish a sentence. Only when the room stops being sure of itself does she lift her eyes. The doorway is filled by a man whose gaze can quiet a room. The laughers forget to laugh, the phones forget to rise, and time remembers it is Christmas Eve. Emily's breath meets the winter air halfway. In the space between them, something undecided gathers like snow that has not yet chosen the ground. And as the pianist holds the last note until it trembles, the world prepares to move again, either toward mercy or toward the old, easy cruelty. The cold marble of the corridor receives her footsteps like a secret confession. Emily walks quickly, not because she is afraid, but because stillness would make her collapse. Behind her, the hum of the restaurant fades into a distant murmur, a memory she already wishes she could erase. Mirrors reflect brief flashes of red, fragments of a woman trying to disappear. The air is thick with cleaning chemicals and the faint sweetness of dessert trays. When the door closes behind her, it feels like sealing herself away from cruelty. The corridor smells of work, not celebration. A place where the shine of the ballroom is washed away by unseen hands. Emily leans against the wall, her back pressed to the cool tile, letting it steady the tremor beneath her ribs. Her fingers curl tightly around the small clutch she still holds, as if it could protect what is left of her pride. The silence is dense, a kind of judgment from the walls themselves. She closes her eyes and lets her breath return to its rhythm. Her dress pulls around her as she slides down to sit on the floor, careful not to cry. There is no point in tears here. The sound of the hotel's heating system hums above her, a low, mechanical lullaby that almost hides the noise of her thoughts. She remembers her mother's voice from years ago, saying that kindness does not survive without courage. She wonders now if she has failed both. A faint melody leaks through the vents. "Oh, holy night," blurred by distance. The irony makes her almost laugh. She studies her reflection in a silver tray stacked nearby. The woman staring back at her seems older, calmer, but cracked in ways invisible to others. The red dress now looks misplaced, too bold for someone who cleans the stains of celebration. Emily presses her palms to the cold floor, feeling the strength return through her skin. If she can survive this silence, she thinks, she can survive almost anything. The thought itself feels like the first step towards standing again. The clock in the hallway ticks with indifferent precision. 3 beats of her heart for every second. The world, it seems, has continued just fine without her. She imagines the laughter above fading into new gossip, her name already losing its sting. For a moment she almost envies that kind of forgetfulness. She whispers to the empty air that she is done hoping for miracles, though her voice trembles with a different kind of hope, the hope of not being broken completely. Footsteps echo softly down the corridor. They are too deliberate to belong to another maid, too sure to belong to a guest who is lost. Emily freezes, every part of her tightening as the sound grows nearer. The rhythm stops a few steps behind her. There is no greeting, no intrusion, just a pause heavy enough to be felt. She does not turn around. The silence itself tells her who it is. Charles stands there, and for a moment, neither of them speaks. The air carries a quiet that feels almost sacred. When he finally exhales, it sounds unplanned, as if even breathing near her pain feels like trespassing. His voice, when it comes, is lower than she expected. He says her name gently, uncertainly, each syllable deliberate. She nods once, her eyes fixed on the floor. The moment stretches like glass about to crack. Her answer is quiet, barely more than a breath. She confirms her name, her tone steady but small. His shoes move softly against the tile, and she senses the distance closing. His scent reaches her first, clean and sharp, an uninvited memory of the place she just fled. He tells her she should not have been alone at that table. The words are meant to comfort, but they land wrong. She replies that she was not alone, and the truth in that sentence makes the silence between them grow colder. He shifts his weight, searching for words that do not exist in his world of control and polished apologies. In the polished surface of a metal cart, she catches his reflection, the outline of power uncertain of itself. His expression is not cruel, only disoriented, as if he has seen something in her that mirrors a flaw in him. For the first time that evening, Emily feels something that almost resembles forgiveness, though she is not sure for whom it is meant. Charles clears his throat softly and asks if she would sit for a moment. The question surprises them both. Emily hesitates, her fingers tightening around her clutch once more. The corridor feels too small for this kind of conversation, yet moving forward seems less painful than remaining here. She gathers her strength, stands, and smooths the fabric of her dress. Her dignity feels stitched together by invisible threads, fragile but intact. Without a word, she follows him down the narrow hallway. As they walk, the sound of the hotel resumes around them. Vacuums hum, elevators sigh. The world keeps turning. Somewhere, Christmas continues, as if her story never happened. She glances back once, toward the service door she closed. It stays shut, sealing the cruelty on the other side. Ahead, Charles walks slower than before, almost waiting for her to match his pace. For the first time that night, Emily feels the weight of silence shifting into something else, an unspoken promise that the story is not over. Before the lights of the hotel and the cruel laughter of the night, there was a smaller world that still smelled of soap and bread. Emily's mornings began with the hiss of the subway doors, the hum of tired people moving through the city's veins. Her uniform folded neatly in a plastic bag, her hair tied back with a ribbon she never replaced. The train windows carried her reflection across tunnels, showing a woman who looked both older and younger than her years. Outside, Manhattan woke slowly, full of lives that never noticed her passing. Her apartment was barely a room, yet it held the warmth of something earned. A small kettle, a chipped mug, a photo of her mother beside a plastic poinsettia that never wilted. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing, laughing, forgiving each other in the same breath. Emily liked the sound of that, people trying. She often sat by the window with her coffee, watching the snow gather on the fire escape. For a few quiet minutes before work, she allowed herself to believe that peace could be simple. At the hotel, she moved like part of the architecture, invisible but essential. She learned to read moods from footsteps, to sense impatience from the way a guest held a glass. Her smile had timing, her silence had grace. The luxury around her glittered with effort she could not afford to rest from. Sometimes, when cleaning a suite with wide windows, she would stop to look at the skyline reflected in the glass, wondering what it might feel like to belong up there. The thought always passed quickly, replaced by the rhythm of duty. The staff locker room smelled of starch and coffee. Laughter bounced between lockers, light but sharp. Most of her colleagues were kind, yet kindness in that world often came wrapped in exhaustion. Some days they gossiped to survive the monotony, trading small cruelties like coins. Emily listened, rarely speaking, always careful to stay polite. Her silence made her easy to underestimate. The others thought her gentle to a fault. They were not wrong, but they were not right either. She had come to New York after her mother's passing, chasing a version of hope that looked like independence. There were letters she never mailed, sketches of dresses folded in a box she kept under her bed. Her mother had taught her to sew, to turn fabric into something graceful, even when life was not. Emily often imagined herself designing gowns for strangers who would never know her name. It wasn't ambition that drove her dream, only the need to create beauty that could not mock her. The Christmas season had always been her favorite, even when she had little to celebrate. She liked the way lights softened the edges of the city, how people became briefly gentle. The hotel decorations were a masterpiece that year, a forest of silver branches and white candles that flickered through the lobby. Emily polished each ornament with the same care she once gave to her mother's china. Every reflection in the glass was a small miracle of light. She wondered if anyone else saw it the way she did. Her supervisor, Mrs. Dalka, often told her that she smiled too easily for someone who worked so hard. Emily took it as a compliment. What Mrs. Dalka did not see was how carefully that smile was built each morning, layer over layer, like makeup to hide fatigue. Beneath it lived a quiet fatigue that no holiday could fix. Still, she carried herself with kindness, believing that how she moved through the world mattered more than what the world returned. There were moments, however, when the loneliness pressed too close. On her breaks, she sometimes stood by the back entrance, watching limousines glide past on the icy street. The reflections on the car doors showed glimpses of lives untouchable and strange. She did not envy them, not exactly. She only wished that someone, someday, would look at her with recognition, as if seeing her meant something more than service. The thought was fragile, but it kept her heart warm against the winter. It was in those quiet days before Christmas that the idea of the blind date appeared, a whisper between laughter, a secret passed from one co-worker to another. At first she dismissed it as a joke, not meant for her. Yet the invitation arrived, printed neatly, placed in her locker without signature. The handwriting was elegant, confident. For a moment she dared to believe in something rare, that someone might have seen her beyond the uniform. Hope entered her life quietly, like the first snow that doesn't yet know it will melt. On the morning of Christmas Eve, she woke before dawn. She ironed her red dress, the one she saved for special moments that never came. The city outside was hushed, wrapped in white. Emily made tea, looked at her reflection in the window, and whispered a promise she had kept since childhood, that goodness, even unnoticed, was still worth carrying. She smiled softly, unaware that by nightfall that very faith would be tested in front of everyone she feared and admired. For now, the day still belonged to peace. The small lounge behind the service corridor was quiet, lit by the yellow glow of a single lamp. Emily stood near the edge of the couch, uncertain if she was meant to sit. Her hands rested over each other like a folded letter. Charles remained by the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor between them. The difference in their worlds was visible even in the silence. His posture belonged to boardrooms and cities. Hers belonged to patience. Between them lingered the faint hum of the hotel's endless machinery. He was still wearing the same dark suit from the restaurant, untouched by the chaos of the moment. His expression was composed, but something in his eyes had softened. For the first time, he looked less like the face on magazine covers and more like a man trying to understand a world that didn't fit inside numbers. Emily lowered her gaze, afraid of meeting it. The smell of coffee drifted from somewhere behind them, mixing with the scent of pine from the Christmas garlands. The air felt too thick for comfort. Charles spoke first, his tone steady but quiet. He asked if she was all right, and she nodded before realizing the gesture might sound dishonest. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than she intended. She said that she was fine, that she was used to mistakes. The sentence was meant to end the moment, but it lingered in the air like smoke. Charles looked at her then, truly looked, and she felt the weight of being seen. Not as an employee, not as a symbol, but as a person who had endured something he could not name. He walked a few steps closer, still unsure of the boundary between compassion and intrusion. Emily stayed still, her breath steady, her dignity rearranged like fragile glass. He asked her to sit. She obeyed, not because of authority, but because standing had begun to feel like defiance. The couch dipped slightly under her weight. Charles remained standing, his presence more formal than necessary. His voice carried a hesitation that betrayed his certainty. It was clear that power had no language for remorse. She spoke first, this time. Her words came slow, careful, the way one handles something broken. She said she did not understand why anyone would find joy in another person's humiliation. Charles looked down, and for a fleeting second, the hardness in him cracked. He said he wished it had not happened, that such cruelty was beneath the place he ran. Emily almost smiled at the irony. Beneath, she thought, was exactly where it had been allowed to live for years. Still, she thanked him, not for his apology, but for speaking at all. For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside the frosted window, snow kept falling in steady silence, reflecting the same white that once filled her childhood. The world seemed cleaner through the glass than it ever did up close. Charles followed her gaze and said he used to like snow as a child, before it began to symbolize inconvenience. Emily replied softly that she still liked it. Their voices barely reached each other, yet in that thin exchange the air grew gentler. Even silence seemed to breathe differently. Charles reached into his jacket and took out a card, sliding it onto the table between them. He said it was his assistant's number, in case she needed anything. Emily looked at it, but did not touch it. She thanked him again, not sure what else to do with his attempt at kindness. The paper looked too white, too sharp against the dark table. He seemed to notice her hesitation and did not insist. Power, for once, chose not to press. The gesture, though awkward, carried a trace of sincerity. Emily asked if he knew about the prank beforehand. He shook his head, quickly, almost offended by the idea. The denial seemed genuine, though she did not know why she believed him. His voice softened as he said that he was sorry on behalf of the hotel. She almost wanted to believe that he meant it personally. Her chest felt tight with conflicting emotions. Shame, anger, gratitude. It was a strange comfort to see discomfort on the face of someone untouchable. The distance between them had changed shape, though it had not vanished. The silence that followed was neither awkward nor cold. It was the kind of silence that allows thought to exist. Emily finally spoke, saying that she planned to finish her shift and go home. Charles nodded, accepting it as final. He seemed about to add something, but stopped. She rose slowly, smoothing her skirt with both hands. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished table. He stepped aside as she passed, offering space instead of command. She walked toward the door without looking back. When she reached the end of the corridor, she paused for just a second. The weight of the evening settled across her shoulders like snow that refused to melt. Behind her, Charles still stood in the same spot, his thoughts unreadable even to himself. Emily took one last breath of the hotel air, filled with perfume and pretense, then stepped into the quieter hall that led to her world. She did not realize yet that the conversation they had just shared would echo in his mind far longer than it would in hers. The morning after Christmas Eve dawned pale and cold. The city outside the hotel was already sweeping away last night's laughter, polishing itself back into indifference. Emily arrived early, her uniform crisp, her smile rehearsed and hollow. The corridors still smelled of pine and champagne. No one mentioned what had happened, though she could feel it whispered beneath greetings that sounded too bright. The silence of others had become her shield, fragile but effective. Charles entered the hotel later than usual. He walked through the lobby as if nothing in the world had shifted, but the moment his eyes caught Emily in the distance, his steps faltered almost imperceptibly. She pretended not to notice. There were guests waiting, rooms to prepare, linens to fold. Her life had rules that left no room for pause. Yet in that instant, he saw how dignity could survive humiliation, how quiet could be stronger than apology. It unsettled him more than he expected. In the staff lounge, Emily sat alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Around her, laughter moved easily among those who knew nothing of the night before. She watched them without resentment. They lived untouched by the memory of being mocked under a chandelier. The world of the rich and the world of the invisible met only in service and spectacle. She wondered which one pitied the other more. The thought brought a small, sad smile to her lips. Charles called for her mid-morning under the pretense of discussing the incident. His office smelled of cedar and paper, its walls lined with awards that glowed under winter light. Emily stood near the door, her posture formal, her hands still. He thanked her for her composure the previous night, but his words sounded rehearsed. She nodded politely, sensing the gap between gratitude and guilt. He spoke like a man trying to fix something that could not be repaired with protocol. He told her that the employees responsible would face consequences. The sentence was firm, practiced, and moral in tone. Emily listened, unsure if justice or pride motivated him. She said softly that she did not want revenge, only respect. The phrase seemed to catch him off guard. His gaze lifted from the papers to her face, as if realizing that her pain was not something he could sign away. The stillness between them grew delicate, almost human. For a moment the office felt smaller, less certain. Her honesty touched something in him, though he could not name it. He said that she had handled herself with grace, and that such strength was rare. The compliment was meant as kindness, but it reached her like a reminder of distance. Grace to him was a choice. To her, it had been survival. Emily thanked him quietly, her voice polite but heavy. She felt the weight of every moment she had been forced to smile through sorrow. Her silence said more than her words ever could. Charles leaned back, watching her with a new kind of curiosity. He realized that she was not seeking his approval, and the discovery unsettled him. For years, people had spoken to him for advantage or admiration. Emily spoke only to be understood. It was a rare thing, and it frightened him slightly, because it revealed how empty most of his conversations had been. He wanted to offer her something, anything, but every word he found felt insufficient. Power once again made him clumsy. Emily noticed his hesitation. For a second, she saw past the expensive suit, past the polished authority, and glimpsed a man uncertain of how to be kind. It was a tender, dangerous realization. She gathered her courage and said that she appreciated his concern, but wished to finish her work. The words were gentle, final. Charles nodded slowly, allowing her to leave, though something in his chest resisted the sound of the door closing. The distance between them returned, but it no longer felt complete. As she walked back through the lobby, Emily felt both lighter and lonelier. The exchange had given her no closure, only clarity. She understood now that people like Charles lived surrounded by walls made of good intentions and cold habits. He had tried to reach her, But even his kindness carried the shape of hierarchy. The pain of it lingered quietly, like frost under sunlight. She told herself she should be grateful that it was over, but a small ache inside whispered that it was not. In his office, Charles sat motionless for several minutes after she left. The image of her calm composure replayed in his mind, each gesture like a line he could not forget. He realized that the moment she apologized to him the night before, apologized for being humiliated, had wounded him in a way no criticism ever had. It was the first wound of understanding, the slow recognition that empathy cannot be ordered or earned. Outside his window, snow continued to fall, covering the city in white silence that looked too much like regret. The storm that followed Christmas left the city glazed in silence. Snow clung to the hotel's high windows, softening even the sharpest corners. Inside, the world moved with its usual precision, but something had shifted beneath the marble floors. Emily felt it in the way people avoided her eyes, as if her calm had turned into a mirror they did not want to face. Every greeting sounded rehearsed, every kindness carried the shadow of guilt. The beauty of the season had already begun to fade. Charles stood at the top floor, looking down at the city through a pane of glass, so clean it erased the sky. His reflection floated there, transparent and unanchored. For years, the view had meant success, but that morning it only reminded him how far he had risen from understanding. His assistant entered quietly, handing him a report about the employees involved in the prank. The names were familiar, loyal, and replaceable. He thanked her, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. He should have been angry. He should have demanded resignations and apologies that sounded sincere. Instead, what he felt was disappointment, an old ache that started in the chest and spread toward memory. He thought of how many times Laughter had echoed in his own meetings, sharp and careless. It was easy to condemn cruelty when it belonged to someone else. The hard part was seeing it in the mirror. Pride was not a crown, he realized. It was armor, and it had cost him the ability to feel. Emily continued her work with quiet efficiency. Her movements were precise, graceful, untouched by bitterness. Yet inside her grew a weariness she could not name. The respect she received now came not from admiration, but from fear of conscience. She noticed the sudden politeness, the careful tones, the empty compliments. They stung worse than mockery. Invisibility had been painful, but being noticed out of guilt was lonelier still. She began to miss her old anonymity. Charles called for the department heads later that afternoon. The meeting room was warm, filled with muted colors and expensive wood. His voice was calm as he addressed them, but his eyes carried the cold clarity of truth. He reminded them that leadership was not permission for cruelty. No one interrupted him. The weight of his authority filled the room like smoke. For a moment, he saw the fear he had built in others, and understood that it was not respect that held his empire together, but distance. After the meeting, he remained alone by the window, the city flickering below him in shades of grey and gold. He could not stop thinking about the look on Emily's face when she said she did not want revenge. It had not been defiance. It had been mercy, and that mercy unsettled him more than accusation ever could. He wondered when he had stopped believing that people like her could still exist. The realization settled deep in him, heavy and quiet, like snow gathering on stone. Emily walked through the staff corridors carrying a tray of linens. A few of her co-workers tried to apologize, their voices trembling with guilt, disguised as friendship. She listened, nodded, and forgave without ceremony. Forgiveness was the only power left to her, and she used it gently. Still, each apology reminded her of the invisible line she could not cross. She belonged to the part of the world that cleaned what others forgot. That truth followed her like a shadow, patient and unending. In his office, Charles found himself unable to return to his routine. The spreadsheets, the calls, the contracts, all the pieces of order he once found comforting had begun to feel hollow. He tried to read, but the words dissolved into thought. The image of Emily, steady in her silence, haunted him with a kind of reverence he did not understand. She had carried shame with grace. He had carried pride like armor. For the first time he wondered which burden weighed more. That evening, the hotel lights dimmed early, as if the building itself was tired. Emily finished her shift and lingered in the corridor, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the window. The snow outside glowed under the street lamps, soft and forgiving. She thought about leaving, about starting somewhere new, somewhere she would not be remembered for someone else's cruelty. The thought frightened her, but it also felt like freedom whispering from a distance she could almost reach. When Charles finally returned to his suite, the city below was buried under quiet. He stood at the window again, watching his own reflection fade into the snow's reflection. Somewhere, a choir sang faintly from a nearby church, the melody too pure for his mood. He picked up his phone, meaning to call his assistant, but paused when he saw Emily's name in a report on his desk. It was then he realized that authority could fix everything but the human heart. Pride had built his world, but compassion, he now understood, was what could save it. The morning light crept through the blinds of her small apartment, turning the grey walls a softer shade. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing the uniform from the day before. The fabric smelled faintly of detergent and exhaustion. She had not slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw faces turned toward her, half amused, half ashamed. The city outside sounded distant, muffled by snow and distance. It was the kind of silence that made choices seem final. She folded her uniform neatly and placed it inside a worn suitcase. It was the only thing she packed with care. The rest of her belongings fit into a small duffel bag, a photo of her mother, a notebook filled with sketches, and the red dress still draped over the chair like an unfinished sentence. The memory of the restaurant returned in flashes of sound, the clinking glasses, the laughter, the hush that followed when Charles entered. She told herself it was only a night, only a mistake, but her heart refused to believe it. At the hotel, the corridors looked brighter than usual. Decorations still glittered, as if unaware of what they had witnessed. Emily walked through them slowly, her steps careful, almost reverent. She stopped by the service desk, where her resignation letter waited. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, not from fear, but from relief. There was nothing dramatic in her gesture. It was simply the act of releasing herself from a world that had never truly seen her. The manager accepted the envelope without protest, his expression uneasy. He offered kind words she did not need, apologies that arrived too late. She thanked him because gratitude was the last form of dignity she could afford. As she turned away, she heard her name whispered behind her, but she did not look back. The lobby was filled with light, and the sound of her footsteps faded into the rhythm of music she could no longer pretend to hear. Her time there had ended quietly, as if it had never begun. Outside, the snow fell heavier than before. Each flake landed softly, as if the sky were trying to erase what had happened. Emily pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the station. The streets of Manhattan were emptying for the holidays, leaving only the sound of her boots against the pavement. She passed the hotel windows one last time and caught her reflection in the glass. A small figure in grey against a field of light. It felt like watching herself disappear. Upstairs, Charles was in his office, reading a report he could not focus on. The city blurred beneath him. His assistant entered, hesitated, and finally spoke. Her words were brief. Emily had resigned. For a moment, he did not understand. The sentence seemed out of place in the quiet room. He looked up slowly, as if hoping to hear it again, hoping it meant something else. But the truth settled fast. He stood, walked to the window and pressed a hand against the cold glass. She was already gone. He left his office without his coat, moving quickly through the corridors. The staff turned their eyes away as he passed. He reached the lobby just in time to see the doors swing shut, the faint outline of her figure already crossing the street. The snow swallowed sound and distance, turning her into a blur of red and grey. He wanted to call out, but found no words that would not sound like command. For once, silence was the only thing he could offer her, and it hurt more than pride ever had. Emily reached the station, her suitcase wheels leaving shallow trails in the snow. The benches were nearly empty, a few travellers wrapped in coats and fatigue. She sat quietly, breathing the metallic cold of the air. Around her, announcements echoed through the vast space, names of places she did not know. She thought of all the rooms she had cleaned, all the smiles she had practiced. The idea of beginning again felt both impossible and necessary. She closed her eyes and waited for courage to catch up with her decision. Back at the hotel, Charles remained by the revolving doors, staring at the empty street. The snow fell thick now, covering footprints before they could be remembered. The hum of the city dimmed into stillness. He wondered when he had last run after anything that mattered. His empire had been built on precision, yet he had failed to recognize the one thing that had moved him without demand. The realization settled like frost inside him. It was not loss that hurt most, but the understanding of what he had failed to keep. In the train station, the loudspeaker called the next departure. Emily stood, her heart heavy but steady. The train doors opened with a hiss that sounded like release. She stepped inside, her reflection vanishing behind the glass as the city began to slide away. Outside, the snow thickened, wrapping Manhattan in silence. Somewhere across that whiteness, Charles remained frozen in place, his breath forming clouds against the night air. Two lives moved in opposite directions, each carrying the weight of what pride had cost them. The city that never slept seemed half asleep beneath the storm. Streetlights blurred into halos, the snow turning every shadow gentle. Emily sat inside the bus terminal, her small suitcase at her feet. Around her, the air smelled of cold coffee and weary travelers. The night pressed close, heavy but calm, as if waiting for her to decide who she would be next. She had no plan, only direction. Anywhere but here, she whispered to herself, watching the doors open and close with mechanical sighs. A child cried softly in the distance, the sound breaking the stillness like glass. Emily wrapped her scarf tighter, her breath visible, fragile. She wondered if starting over meant losing the last pieces of herself that still believed in good. The station clock marked the slow crawl of minutes. She thought about the hotel, the faces, the laughter, the man who had looked at her with something almost kind. It would be easier to hate him, she realized. Hate required less energy than understanding. But inside the ache, there was still gratitude for the moment he had stepped in when no one else had. Outside, the wind rose and scattered the snow into spirals of light. She felt like one of them, carried without direction, too light to land, too heavy to rise. Her mother's voice came back from memory, calm and unshaken. Kindness is never wasted, even when it hurts. Emily let the words settle inside her like a faint ember. For the first time that night, she felt warmth that did not come from her coat. Across the city, Charles walked through empty streets, his shoes sinking into snow untouched by cars. He had left the hotel without destination, guided only by restlessness. The air burned cold against his throat, but it cleared his mind. He replayed her last glance, the quiet strength behind it. For a man who could buy silence, he now realized he could not bear it. He stopped outside a closed bakery, staring at the reflection of his own life in the window. Behind the glass were cakes no one would eat, beauty made useless by timing. He thought of Emily, of how dignity could make poverty look like grace. Somewhere, a church bell rang midnight. The sound reached him like an invitation to remember who he had been before ambition hardened his heart. At the terminal, Emily bought a cup of weak coffee from a vending machine. The heat stung her palms and steadied her breathing. Across from her, a woman in a charity vest was handing blankets to people who had nowhere to go. The volunteer's smile was small, but sincere. Emily watched her for a long moment, recognizing a kind of courage that did not ask to be seen. The volunteer noticed her gaze and approached. She offered a warm drink and a quiet question about whether Emily had somewhere to stay. For a second, Emily wanted to lie. Instead, she said she was between places. The woman nodded, without pity, only understanding. That simple kindness felt like an answer to a prayer Emily had not known she was saying. Back on the street, Charles stopped beside a church whose doors were still open. He stepped inside, where candles flickered beneath the scent of wax and pine. He sat at the last pew, unsure whether to pray or simply listen. The choir rehearsed softly in another room, the notes drifting like forgiveness through stone. For the first time in years, he whispered a thank you to no one in particular. Emily accepted the blanket and the cup of cocoa, her hands trembling with exhaustion and gratitude. Around her, voices blended in low, comforting tones. The night was still cold, but it no longer felt empty. She did not yet know where morning would find her, but for now, she was safe. And somewhere across the city, another soul sat in silence, learning that regret could be the first language of grace. Morning crept into the terminal like forgiveness, soft and uncertain. The snow outside had stopped, leaving behind a city washed clean. Emily woke to the faint sound of laughter, the kind that belonged to people who had nothing left to prove. Around her, the volunteers were preparing breakfast for the homeless. The smell of bread and coffee filled the air like a hymn. The same woman from the night before smiled when she saw her awake. She introduced herself as Marlene, a volunteer with the community shelter downtown. Her voice was calm, the kind that carried no questions. Emily helped fold blankets without being asked, grateful for something to do. The act of motion felt like prayer, her body remembering what kindness could build. By mid-morning, Marlene invited her to come to the shelter. It was only temporary, she said, until Emily decided her next step. The building was small, warm, and filled with noise that sounded like living. Children chased each other through the hallways, their laughter pure and loud. Emily felt invisible again, but this time it didn't hurt. To disappear into compassion was a different kind of peace. The kitchen became her refuge. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began washing dishes beside strangers who worked like family. Steam rose from the sinks, curling into halos above their heads. She moved quietly, her rhythm steady and graceful. Someone played music from an old radio, and the melody filled the room with gentle warmth. It felt almost like home. That afternoon, she joined the volunteers in serving meals at the long wooden tables. People lined up with patience and hunger in their eyes. When Emily handed them plates, they looked at her not as a servant, but as an equal. Each thank you reached her deeper than any tip or smile from the hotel ever had. The world, she thought, could be cruel, but it could also be kind if you chose where to stand. Outside the windows, the city gleamed under pale sunlight. Snow melted into the gutters, whispering of new beginnings. Emily paused for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched the street. Life went on, unbothered by yesterday's pain. It no longer frightened her. Pain had become a teacher, and humility its lesson. Hope, she realized, was not a miracle. It was a choice made quietly, again and again. Across town, Charles sat in his office, surrounded by silence. The work that once demanded his every breath now seemed meaningless. He opened a drawer and found the card he had given Emily still there, unused. He turned it between his fingers like a confession. Outside his window, he saw people crossing the street, carrying groceries and small joys. He envied their simplicity more than their freedom. Later that day, his assistant mentioned that one of their company's charity partners was hosting a Christmas lunch for the poor. He approved the donation automatically, then paused. A strange pull urged him to attend. He had not visited one of those events in years. He told himself it was to observe, to understand the company's impact. But deep down, he already knew it was something else entirely. At the shelter, Marlene told Emily about the same event, explaining they needed more hands to serve meals. Emily agreed without hesitation. She felt lighter, stronger, like the rhythm of giving had begun to heal her. That night, she slept for the first time in days. The sound of the city outside her window felt no longer cold, but alive. Somewhere deep within her, something had quietly shifted toward hope. The next morning, the air carried the promise of brightness. Emily dressed simply, her hair pinned back, her smile genuine. The tables were set, the aroma of roasted food filling the hall. People began to arrive in slow, grateful waves. She looked around and saw faces both weary and kind. And just as she turned toward the door to greet the next guest, the light changed. Someone new had stepped inside, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The door of the shelter opened slowly, letting in a current of cold air and something quieter than surprise. Emily looked up from the serving table, her hands still resting on a tray of bread. For a moment she thought her mind was playing tricks, shaping hope out of memory. But then she saw him, Charles, standing in the doorway, his expression caught between disbelief and humility. The world around them seemed to still. He was not in a suit this time. His coat was plain, his scarf dark with melted snow. He looked smaller somehow, though the room seemed to expand to make space for him. The other volunteers greeted him with polite smiles, unaware of the invisible story between them. Emily stood frozen, her heart stumbling against her ribs. She did not know whether to move or stay. Charles stepped closer, his eyes searching the room until they found hers. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation faded around them. Time had folded itself into this single moment, neither past nor present, only recognition. He stopped a few steps away, unsure of what words could fit this distance. Emily's fingers tightened around the tray as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Marlene broke the silence first, handing Charles a ladle and pointing toward the serving line. He accepted it with a quiet nod, his hands uncertain but willing. The image was strange and beautiful. The man who had once owned empires now standing beside her, serving food to strangers. Emily turned back to her work, her pulse steadying with each motion. The ordinary grace of service wrapped them both in stillness. For a while, neither of them spoke. They passed plates and smiles and fragments of warmth. Charles noticed how she greeted each person by name, how her voice softened with care. There was no bitterness in her gestures, no trace of pride. He wondered how she had learned to transform pain into something so generous. The weight of his own heart felt heavier in comparison. When the line finally slowed, Emily placed the last plate on the table and exhaled. Her hands trembled slightly, the fatigue of both memory and effort. Charles stood beside her, silent but near. The air between them carried the scent of food, soap, and faint pine. He wanted to apologize again, but knew it would only reopen what she had already closed. Instead, he said the simplest thing he could think of. "Thank you." The words caught her off guard. She turned to look at him, searching his face for irony, and found none. There was sincerity there, raw and quiet, the kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness, but offers it. She nodded once, her eyes bright but steady. The moment was small, but it was the first bridge that did not crumble beneath the weight of their differences. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, softer this time, as if the world itself had chosen gentleness. The volunteers laughed while cleaning the tables, and the sound carried a warmth that felt almost holy. Emily stepped toward the window, watching the flakes drift past the glass. Behind her, she could hear Charles speaking with Marlene about the shelter's needs. His tone was low, almost reverent. He walked over to her before leaving, holding a folded envelope. Inside, he said, was an invitation to discuss a community project his foundation was launching. Emily hesitated before accepting it, unsure if this was charity or something else. His eyes, calm and unguarded, told her it was respect. She took the envelope carefully, not as a promise, but as a possibility. When he finally stepped outside, the door closed behind him with a soft sound, like breath meeting winter. Emily remained still for a long moment, the envelope warm in her hands. Through the frosted window she watched him walk away, his figure fading into the falling snow. She did not chase him, nor did she turn away. Hope, once cruel and fragile, had returned quietly, disguised as grace. The next morning arrived pale and slow, sunlight stretching across the city like a hesitant hand. Emily stood outside the shelter, the envelope still folded in her pocket. She had not opened it yet. Something about it felt sacred, like a door that should only be touched when the heart was ready. The streets were busy again, yet she felt strangely apart from the noise, as if walking in another world. She found the courage that afternoon, sitting at a park bench near the frozen fountain. Inside the envelope was a letter written in careful handwriting. It was an invitation to meet at his office, signed simply with his name. The message was formal, but beneath the formality she sensed something else, an effort to reach her without command. The sight of it filled her with both curiosity and unease. When she entered the building the next day, the same marble floors that once echoed her humiliation now carried her steady steps. The receptionist greeted her kindly this time, her tone soft, respectful. Emily waited by the window, tracing the skyline through the glass. She thought of how easily the city forgot, yet how the heart remembered everything it needed to learn. Then the door opened, and Charles appeared, looking both relieved and uncertain. He asked her to sit. The room was quiet except for the sound of wind pressing faintly against the windows. On the table lay a folder, her name written neatly on the cover. Charles took a deep breath before speaking, as if each word required permission. He told her he had reviewed everything that happened that night, every report, every witness. The people responsible were gone. It had not been a gesture of charity, but of justice delayed. Emily listened, her eyes lowered but alert. She felt no triumph, only a calm that came from surviving something that no longer defined her. Charles spoke again, slower now, confessing that her silence had unsettled him more than any accusation. He said that she had reminded him of what decency looked like, something he had not seen clearly in years. The words carried no performance, only weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The light shifted through the window, cutting across his desk like a blade of mercy. Emily lifted her gaze and met his eyes fully for the first time. There was no superiority there, only humanity, flawed and fragile. She thanked him for what he had done, but added softly that some wounds did not need witnesses to heal. The statement surprised him. It was not bitterness, only truth. Charles leaned back, his fingers interlaced, his expression thoughtful. He asked if she would consider working with his foundation, designing a program to help others like her. It was the kind of offer that once would have thrilled her, but now it felt complicated. She looked at him quietly, sensing that even kindness could carry imbalance. Her silence was not rejection, but reflection. She needed to know that his motives were more than remorse. He seemed to understand, though she said nothing. He admitted that perhaps the offer was as much for him as for her, a way to make right what had been wrong. His honesty disarmed her more than his power ever could. For the first time, she saw the man behind the legend, vulnerable and searching. It was a strange comfort, the way truth could soften everything it touched. Still, she felt the need to protect her peace. Emily stood, her decision gentle but firm. She said she would think about it, that she was grateful for his sincerity, but she could not accept out of gratitude alone. His eyes followed her as she moved toward the door, his expression unreadable. He did not stop her. The silence between them had changed. It no longer hurt. It simply existed. Outside, the sky was a deepening grey, filled with the promise of snow. As she stepped into the street, the city lights blinked on one by one, reflections glimmering in puddles of melted frost. Emily breathed deeply, the air sharp and alive. She did not feel small this time. Behind her, in a tall glass office, a man sat alone with the realization that redemption was not a single act, but a slow, quiet becoming. Somewhere in both of them, something fragile had shifted toward truth. The following day arrived with a strange quietness that felt almost expectant. Emily walked through the park near the foundation building, her thoughts caught between gratitude and uncertainty. The invitation still echoed in her mind, not as an opportunity, but as a question. What did it mean to be helped by the same world that once humiliated you? The answer was not simple, and the air itself seemed to wait for her to find it. Inside his office, Charles paced by the window, watching the city move beneath him. He had built his empire on precision and logic, yet neither could help him now. He kept replaying their last conversation, her calm voice, her unshaken dignity. The memory unsettled him more than any failure. When the intercom buzzed to announce her arrival, his pulse betrayed him, quickening with something close to fear. Emily entered the room with quiet grace. She wore no makeup, no mask, only the steadiness that comes from knowing one's worth. Charles greeted her with a nod, words failing him for a moment. The air between them was charged, but not hostile, like two storms meeting without thunder. He gestured toward the chair, and she sat, her gaze clear, her posture unbending. The city outside blurred into light and shadow. He began to speak carefully, explaining the vision for the Foundation's project. His words were rehearsed, the kind that sound generous but calculated. Emily listened, her expression patient, almost gentle. When he finished, she waited before answering, letting silence do its work. Then she said that what he called charity often looked like control to those who had never owned anything. Her voice did not accuse, it revealed. Charles froze, her words striking deeper than criticism. He asked if she truly believed he was trying to control her. She said she didn't think he meant to, but that power always carried habit. It was not his fault, she added softly, but it was his responsibility. The sentence landed quietly, yet its truth filled the room. For the first time, he did not defend himself. Pride could not breathe in air this honest. He looked away, his reflection caught in the window's glass. For years he had believed goodness could be managed like any enterprise. But the woman before him was teaching him otherwise, without even trying. He turned back, his voice lower, uncertain. He admitted that he did not know how to make things right. The admission felt strange on his tongue, like a foreign language finally spoken aloud. Emily's expression softened. She told him that maybe rightness wasn't the point, that sometimes what mattered most was the willingness to see. Her tone carried no anger, only compassion. He watched her carefully, realizing that forgiveness looked nothing like weakness. It was strength choosing peace. Yet even as he understood, he knew he was not ready to let her go again. Silence stretched long between them, not awkward but full. Charles stepped closer, searching her face for any sign of resentment. Instead, he found calm resolve. She stood, her eyes level with his. Her next words were steady, almost tender. She said she could not work for him, not yet. Not until his offer came from equality, not pity. Then she turned toward the door. He wanted to stop her, to speak, but nothing came. The noise of the city outside rose faintly, cars moving like distant memories. Emily paused at the threshold, not to hesitate, but to honor the moment. Without looking back, she said quietly that he already had what he needed to change. He just had to listen to the part of himself that no one else could command. Then she left, leaving the air trembling in her absence. Charles remained still, her words echoing in the quiet. The office seemed larger now, emptier, the polished walls reflecting more light than warmth. He sat down slowly, his hands resting flat on the desk. In the distance, he could hear church bells ringing noon. Their sound filled the room like truth does when finally accepted, not loud, but undeniable. Pride had lost, and something better had begun to take its place. The next morning dawned clear after days of restless grey. The city glistened under a thin veil of frost, as if the night had washed away its arrogance. At the shelter, the volunteers were already at work preparing meals for another long day. Emily tied her apron in silence, her movements steady, almost ritualistic. She had learned to expect nothing, and because of that, every kindness still felt miraculous. Outside, a black car stopped by the curb, unnoticed at first. The driver remained inside, while a figure stepped out, tall and familiar, carrying no entourage, no distance. Charles crossed the small courtyard with careful steps, each one quieter than the last. He wore no overcoat of importance this time, only a simple sweater and gloves. The air around him seemed to hum with intention, not power. Marlene greeted him first, surprised but kind. He asked if he could volunteer, his tone humble but certain. She handed him an apron and pointed toward the kitchen. The moment felt surreal, like watching a storm kneel before the sea. Emily turned just in time to see him enter, sleeves rolled, eyes steady. The room fell silent for half a heartbeat, then resumed its rhythm, folding him into its music. Charles began washing dishes, the sink steaming before him. His movements were awkward at first, too careful, but sincerity replaced precision. Emily watched from the corner, unsure if she was witnessing penance or transformation. The others treated him as one of their own, teasing lightly, laughing without fear. It was the first time she had seen him among equals, and something inside her eased. Hours passed unnoticed. He served food, carried trays, refilled coffee cups. Each gesture stripped another layer of distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. The cameras that arrived later belonged to the press, drawn by rumor, hungry for spectacle. But what they found instead was quiet redemption. A billionaire wearing an apron, smiling at strangers as if it were the only thing he had ever wanted to do. Emily stood beside him, helping distribute the final plates. Their shoulders brushed once, lightly, without tension. He looked at her then, truly looked, and the noise around them faded. Gratitude, humility, and something wordless passed between them. She nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement that forgiveness was not an event but a process. In that single glance, something in both of them healed. Outside, reporters shouted questions, flashes of light bouncing off the frosted glass. Charles ignored them, focusing on the people still waiting for food. His voice carried warmth now, unguarded, almost gentle. Emily realized that this act was not for publicity. It was for peace. His, hers, and perhaps something larger. The world beyond the shelter would spin its stories, but truth had already spoken quietly inside. When the crowd dispersed, the two remained behind, cleaning tables in companionable silence. The sound of running water filled the space where words might have been. Charles turned to her once more and said that change was easier to promise than to live. She smiled faintly, understanding. For the first time, she saw him not as the man from that night, but as someone learning how to be whole. As they stepped outside, the snow began to fall again, the flakes soft as breath. Charles looked at the sky, then at her, and said that the world looked different when you stopped standing above it. She answered that it always had. He had just been too tall to see it clearly. He laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that seemed to melt the air between them. Even the cold felt lighter. For a long moment they stood together in the whiteness, the noise of the city fading into distant bells. No grand declarations, no promises, only recognition. Two lives meeting halfway across regret and grace. The light of afternoon glimmered against the snow, turning their reflections into something gentle and infinite. The world had not changed, but they had, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and winter began to loosen its grip. The city softened under gentler light, the snow melting into quiet rivers along the streets. The shelter had grown busier, alive with laughter and rhythm. Emily's days followed a peaceful pattern, filled with small joys and steady work. Each evening she felt lighter, as if the cold had taken a piece of her sorrow when it left. Charles visited often, no longer as a guest, but as part of the place. He spoke less and listened more, learning the language of humility one gesture at a time. The volunteers treated him with casual warmth, teasing him when he misplaced utensils or burned toast. Emily watched the change unfold slowly, not as a miracle, but as a man simply becoming kind. The sight moved her in ways she could not yet name. One afternoon, he approached her with sketches and notes spread across a folder. They were plans for a new foundation project, a training center for underprivileged youth. He wanted her opinion, not her approval. Emily studied the drawings, tracing the shapes with her fingertips. For the first time, she saw her own ideas reflected there. Her taste, her perspective, her voice, it felt like being seen without being displayed. They began working together in the weeks that followed. Meetings turned into conversations and tasks into shared quiet. Sometimes they disagreed, but even those moments carried respect. Emily found herself laughing again, the kind of laughter that came easily and healed something unseen. Charles noticed, and though he said nothing, the sound became his favorite part of the day. It reminded him that forgiveness was not owed, but given. The center's construction began in early spring. Charles insisted on visiting the site every morning, trading polished shoes for boots. Emily walked beside him, taking notes, greeting workers by name. Their presence together no longer drew whispers. It inspired calm. She realized that redemption looked less like apology and more like participation. The foundation was not just a building. It was proof that pain could grow roots and bear kindness. One afternoon, rain replaced the snow, soft and cleansing. They stood beneath a makeshift roof, watching droplets slide down sheets of glass. Charles turned to her and said quietly that he had spent his whole life trying to be admired when all he wanted was to be useful. Emily looked at him for a long time before answering. She told him that being useful to others was how love first learns to speak. The rain covered the silence that followed. From that day on, the distance between them no longer felt like difference. They worked side by side, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply sharing stillness. The trust that had once trembled now stood steady between them, quiet and sure. Emily no longer thought of the night in the restaurant. It had become a shadow swallowed by light. In its place grew something softer, built not on apology, but on understanding. When the center finally opened, the city was blooming again. Children ran through the halls, their laughter filling every corner like sunlight. Charles stood beside her during the opening ceremony, not as a benefactor, but as a partner in purpose. Cameras flashed, but neither looked at them. Their attention belonged to the people they had built this for. The moment was both ordinary and sacred, the kind that lingers long after applause ends. As the guests left, Emily lingered in the quiet lobby. The walls glowed with late afternoon light, the same golden warmth that once reflected from hotel chandeliers. Charles joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. They sat on the steps, shoulders almost touching. Words felt unnecessary. The peace between them spoke in silence, soft and whole, the kind that asked for nothing more. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world smelled clean, renewed. Emily reached over and placed her hand gently over his, a gesture not of romance, but of trust. He looked at her with quiet gratitude, his eyes calm for the first time in years. In that stillness, they both understood that healing was not forgetting, it was remembering without pain, and for the first time both believed in beginnings again. A year passed like a deep breath finally released. The city dressed itself again in lights and songs, the air filled with the scent of pine and promise. Emily stood by the window of her new apartment, watching the snow fall softly onto the streets below. Her life was no longer quiet with sorrow, but calm with meaning. For the first time in years, Christmas felt like a return, not a reminder. Downstairs, the new community center glowed with life. Children decorated a tree made of paper stars, each one bearing a wish. Volunteers moved through the halls with laughter that echoed gently against the walls. Emily walked among them, her steps sure and steady, carrying warmth instead of hesitation. Every corner of that place carried a piece of the heart that once broke and learned to mend. Charles arrived later, dressed simply, a small box in his hand. The crowd greeted him with affection, not awe. He found Emily near the entrance, speaking with a group of students about their first sewing workshop. She turned, smiled, and for a moment both forgot the noise around them. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, the kind that only forgiveness builds. He handed her the box with a quiet smile. Inside was a silver pendant, shaped like a snowflake, delicate and imperfect. It was engraved with 2 words, "Begin again." Emily touched it carefully, her eyes glistening. She thanked him, her voice soft but sure. He nodded once, as if the gesture itself meant more than words could hold. The center's choir began to sing in the main hall. Their voices carried through the air like prayer, simple and bright. Emily and Charles walked side by side toward the sound, stopping by the doorway to listen. The children sang about light returning after the long dark. She felt the lyrics settle in her chest, reminding her that even broken things could glow if held with kindness. The truth had never sounded so beautiful. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and forgiving. Through the large windows, the city shimmered under white, and for a moment it looked at peace. Emily watched the reflection of the children's faces against the glass, every smile a piece of redemption. Charles stood beside her, his hands folded loosely, his posture no longer heavy. It was as if he had finally learned how to stand without walls. As the song ended, the children ran to hand out small ornaments they had made themselves. One of them placed a paper star in Emily's hand. It read, "Thank you for making the world kind." She looked down at it, her throat tight with quiet joy. Sometimes, she thought, love was nothing more than building something gentle in the ruins of what once hurt. When the guests began to leave, Charles lingered near the door, watching her speak with the families. There was no distance left, only gratitude. He realized that redemption was never about grand gestures. It lived in the small, consistent ways we choose to see others. The lesson was simple and endless, and he carried it like a prayer. Later that night, the center grew still. Emily stood beneath the tree of paper stars, the pendant cold against her skin, the lights reflecting in her eyes. She thought of the girl who once sat alone in a restaurant, waiting for something beautiful to happen. She smiled faintly, realizing that the miracle had not been what she expected, it had been what she became afterward. The past was no longer her burden, but her proof. Outside, bells rang through the falling snow. Emily turned off the lights, the glow of the stars fading into quiet peace. As she stepped into the night, she felt the city breathe again, calm and alive. Somewhere above her, the sky shimmered with forgiveness. And as her footsteps disappeared into the snow, her heart whispered softly, "Thank you." If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.